Hi guys, today we're going to talk about nouns and pronouns. So we're going to define the different types of nouns and pronouns in the English language. And we're going to talk about some issues that come up when teaching nouns and pronouns, and even get an example of how to teach pronouns. So nouns can be broken into proper nouns and common nouns. Proper nouns are nouns when we talk about proper names, such as Mrs. Kelly Coronado, or names of cities, Chicago, names of state, Illinois, names of countries. And then common nouns are everything else. So people, places, things, and animals. Common nouns can be divided into what we call count nouns and non-count nouns. So what are count nouns? Count nouns are nouns we can count. And this is important in teaching because sometimes students get confused about what can and can't be count, and also which determiners, and in this case we're talking about the determiners that are quantifiers that can be placed in front of them. So when we talk about count nouns, they can be counted. So the determiners you can use some, right? I have some chairs in my house, a lot of, many. Okay, there are many animals in my house too. Not sure why. We can use the articles a and an, because those articles point to something that isn't specific, such as there is a girl crossing the street, but they also mean one. Okay, there is one girl crossing the street. So if you can't count a noun, you can't use the articles a or an in front of it. We can also use the, several, a few, and you can count. So you can use numbers with them. Finally, you can use the quantifier any, but that only works in questions and the negative. And I'll show you on this chart. Okay, so count nouns, so they can be singular. And there you see examples in the affirmative and the negative. There is a dog. Okay, notice how a can mean one. I can also say there are 2 dogs, 3 dogs, several dogs. Or there isn't an apple. In the plural, in the affirmative, there we have examples. There are many apples. You can also say how many. There are 12 apples. There are some dogs, or there are 3 dogs. Okay, so your basic count nouns. And in the negative, we can say there aren't many apples, or there aren't 2 or 3 apples. And here's where we have that any. So any can only be used in a question or negative. There aren't any dogs, right? We can't, meaning there are 0 dogs. We can't say there are any dogs. See that? But you could ask, are there any dogs? Or use it in the negative. There aren't any dogs. Okay, so that's a basic overview of what are count nouns in English. And because they're count nouns, we can use different determiners, which are quantifiers. So we learned that when we talked about the different phrases in English, in those noun phrases with those count nouns. So next we'll talk about non-count nouns. So non-count nouns are just that. They're nouns that you can't count. So they can only be used in the singular. So you can see in this chart there isn't plural. And usually in ESL, when we teach non-count nouns, we might teach them in categories, such as you could have categories of food. So types of food that you can't count, okay, such as cheese, right? You can say types of cheese, but we don't say he has 3 cheeses. Or wine, right? You can have types of wine, but you can't say he has 3 wines. Okay, so generally we break up non-count nouns into categories to try to teach them. And some of the categories can be more difficult for students to grasp than others. So again, we have which determiners, which in this case would be quantifiers, can we use with non-count nouns? Because you can't count them. So you can't use the articles a or an. You can't use numbers, but you can say some, right? I had some wine. It means an amount of. A lot of. I had a lot of coffee for breakfast. Coffee is another one you can't count. You can say I had a cup of coffee, but you can't say I had 2 coffees. Although, how often do you go to Starbucks and say, can I get a coffee? That's one of those spoken, informal, irregular uses. And the person behind the counter knows that what you mean is a cup of coffee, even though you say a coffee. Just a little aside. And as you teach English, you start to realize more and really think about the things we say and why we say them and all the irregularities that your students will hear when they're out in the world. So anyway, we can use much with non-count nouns, but we can't use many. We can say a little. So you see, these are quantifiers that are talking about an amount of something, but not counting something. Okay, again, we can use the, and again, we can use any in questions and the negative only. So we look over at the singular, the affirmative, there is some sugar. Okay, there we have another type of food that can't be counted. It's just an amount of. There is a little traffic. And there isn't any plural, but in the negative, there isn't much traffic, meaning there's only a little. There isn't any sugar, which means the same thing as it does with count nouns, meaning 0. Now, I think the hardest category of count nouns that in my teaching that I've seen students have difficulty with are those count nouns that mean collections of things. Okay, such as, so if we think of what's a collection of things? Furniture. Okay, so that's a collection of things. Think about all the things in your house that can be furniture. So you can't count furniture. You can't say I have 3 furnitures in my house, but you can say I have 3 beds, I have 5 chairs, I have 2 sofas. It's the same with clothing. You can't say I have 20 clothings in my closet, but you can say I have 20 shirts, I have 10 skirts, I have 20 pairs of pants. See how that works? So it's those groups of things that students tend to have difficulty with when we're talking about non-count nouns. Okay, so beyond count and non-count nouns, proper and common nouns, the next category of nouns we have are pronouns. So pronouns take the place of nouns. We have subject pronouns that will take place of nouns that are in the subject position. We have object pronouns that will take place of nouns that are in the object position. We also have reflexive pronouns that talk about pronouns that refer to something that was mentioned earlier, and that something is the same person or the same thing. So, for example, Kelly looked at herself in the mirror. Kelly didn't look at someone else. She looked at herself. So above me, you see a sentence. Kelly gave Greta some chocolate. So why did I put it there? I put it there to show you what students tend to have difficulty with when choosing pronouns to take places of nouns. The biggest difficulty that I've seen comes when they don't know whether to choose a subject or an object pronoun. And that makes sense because a lot of native speakers mix up subject and object pronouns. So the first thing you have to know is, what do objects do in the sentences? So subjects seem to be easy. Subjects are the doers in the sentence, the who or what the sentence is about. They perform the action. Or when it's a stative verb, they are who or what is being described. So Kelly gave Greta some chocolate. Who or what is the doer of the action in that sentence? Who is that sentence about? Kelly. That's simple. Okay, so if I were to replace Kelly with a pronoun, I would use the pronoun I, the subject pronoun. But it gets tricky when we're talking about objects, because a lot of people forget or never learned or never internalized what objects do in sentences. So we basically have three types of objects. We have direct objects. And I always tell my students, direct objects answer the questions who or what from the verb. So Kelly gave. What did Kelly give? Chocolate. That's the direct object. So you take the action and you ask who or what? Kelly gave. What did Kelly give? Chocolate. Chocolate is the direct object. So next we have indirect objects. Indirect objects always answer the questions to whom or for whom. So Kelly gave chocolate. To whom did Kelly give chocolate? Greta. That's the indirect object in the sentence. So sometimes, not just our students, but also native speakers, just aren't sure that something is an object and not a subject. And I find that no matter how high of a level students are, and no matter how many times they're told what a direct object or an indirect object is, they don't internalize the rule, which is something that's debated in second language acquisition, is whether or not students actually ever internalize rules or if they just learn how to use things correctly, as native speakers do. So here I have another sentence. Between you and me, Greta loves chocolate. So this is our third type of object, the object of the preposition. So you might remember from when we talked about phrases that in prepositional phrases, you have a preposition plus a noun phrase. And that noun phrase is the object of that preposition. And this is the main case in which both non-native speakers and native speakers choose the wrong pronoun. Between you and me. How often do you hear people say between you and I? Okay, so that you and me, that's the noun phrase in the prepositional phrase, but it is the object of the preposition. So saying between you and me is correct. Between you and I is not correct. So that is probably the most common error in choosing pronouns. And since it's an error for both English language learners as well as native speakers of English, it's very common, and I mean, it's probably not the worst error a student can make, but it's just something that I point out as I'm teaching. So your chapter mentions, when talking about errors, do we constantly point out errors to students? And do they even internalize it when we point them out? No, not always. And you don't want to constantly correct and overcorrect. But things like this, things that are so common, what I do is that I point them out to students as I'm teaching it. So as soon as I start talking about pronouns, I point out, okay, what are the most common mistakes, to see if they can keep on top of it while they're even learning it in the first place. Okay, so we just have a few more types of pronouns to talk about. The first one is possessive pronouns. And the main point there, and I don't believe your book mentioned this, but when I'm teaching it, I point out the difference between possessive pronouns and possessive adjectives. Okay? So, for example, if I say, this is my pen, that my is a possessive adjective, another determiner, pointing to that noun, so that it's the determiner, my, in that noun phrase, pen being the noun. Now, once they know that I'm talking about my pen or a pen, we don't need that possessive adjective. That's where we can use a possessive pronoun. And I can say, this pen is mine. Okay? Or I can hear our dog barking downstairs. Okay? Our dog. That's a possessive adjective. Our. That dog belongs to us. Okay? But once we know that we're talking about the dog, I can use that possessive pronoun and say the dog is ours. So that's the difference. Indefinite pronouns. So these can be tricky for students. The pronouns that start with some, every, no, somebody, someone, nobody, no one, everyone, everybody. And there's a few reasons they're tricky. The first reason is subject-verb agreement. Everybody in the classroom needs to open their book. So I'm addressing everybody or everyone, meaning all of the students, but it's singular. So that can be confusing because what you mean is everyone, every individual needs. It's singular. So that's the first part that's tricky for students. The second part that's tricky, and this is, I'm getting excited again, I'm getting excited about grammar because this is a grammatical change, is what pronoun do we use to refer back to an indefinite pronoun? So I just said everybody in the class needs to open their book. Now, back in the day, we would have said, or we would have been taught to say, everybody in the class needs to open his book, because you're referring back to a singular individual. And back in the day, if you were referring to a singular individual in which the gender wasn't known, you just use his. And then later on, like when I was in graduate school and first started teaching, it changed to, okay, we don't always have to use his. We could use her, or we could use his or her, right? Everyone in the classroom needs to open his or her book. But now there's a move to not put a gender on language. And so, and I think that most native speakers usually would do this in speaking. Instead of saying his or her, they would just use the plural. Everyone needs to open their book. So that's always kind of been in a way of speaking, but not of writing. But now it's becoming more appropriate to use the plural as, sorry, this is new for me, so I have to think about it because now I'm changing what I'm teaching because the language has changed, which is cool. So you're using the plural, but as a singular pronoun. Yes. Okay, so everyone needs to open their book. So it's cool. It's a language change. As we talked about in an earlier video, that languages constantly evolve. And this is a reflection of the culture evolving, and it's seen in the language. And I believe your book mentions this and talks about it in a little more detail. So at this point, I'm really not sure what's most acceptable, to say his or her, or to say their, but it's a current language change. I mean, I would say in spoken language to say their, but in written language, it's really going to depend on the professor and what the professor takes as proper use of pronouns. Okay, and then finally, demonstrative pronouns. These are very interesting. So this, that, these, and those. So this pen, or if I have more than one, these pens, refers to things that are close to us. That pen over there, those pens over there, refer to things that are far away from us. Okay, that's not really a problem for students to learn. Notice I just said that's not really a problem for students to learn. But that, what I just said, is difficult for students. We use this and that to refer to previous ideas. When I just said that really isn't a problem for students to learn, I was referring to the previous idea I had stated about using this and these for something close and that and those for something far away. So in speaking, as well as reading, this is very difficult in reading comprehension. When we get to the higher levels, in writing, people use this and that to refer to something that was stated, a whole sentence, a couple clauses, a whole idea that was stated earlier on in the reading. For example, you're reading something and it says something like, the boy who always did well in school did poorly on his last exam. That really upset his mother. So that is referring back to the whole idea previously that he didn't do well on his last exam. So your book mentions that in a lot of reading texts, there are a lot of exercises that ask students to find the pronouns and then draw an arrow or talk about what nouns they refer to. Okay, what's the antecedent? And your book also mentions that that's kind of a waste of time because that isn't what students have difficulty with. And I agree. I mean, I don't think it hurts to do those exercises, but I don't really see them having difficulty with that. What they have the most difficulty with is what I talked about before, is being sure that they have chosen the correct pronoun in speaking and or writing, and also with this and that in reading and figuring out what it refers to. So next I'm going to just talk about a few things that we can do in classes to teach pronouns or have students do exercises in pronouns. Okay, so what can we do to teach pronouns? So we talked about how many books have students find the pronouns and talk about or draw an arrow to its antecedent. And your book states that that may be a waste of time. I think when students are first learning, that those are good activities because they're first learning, okay, what are pronouns and what do they do in the sentence? But I think we always have to remember when we talk about language teaching, that communicative language teaching is probably the most widely used and most successful in that it has students use language naturally. But most programs, and such as our program at Harper, it mixes different types of language teaching techniques. So we do teach a lot of grammar, but then we have students use it as much as possible to try to get them to internalize those rules. So your book mentioned strip stories, and I thought this was kind of fun. I found this Garfield cartoon, which are always fun. I love Garfield. And this, I didn't take the things out, but if you look at the cartoon, so John is out to dinner. Oh, what's wrong, John? Oh, I feel guilty about leaving Garfield and Odie alone. That's sweet. I can just see them waiting at the door for me. So already we have subject pronouns. We have object of the preposition pronouns. Another subject, you shouldn't feel guilty about leaving. Sorry, my battery is getting low. We have possessive adjectives. So what you could do here is delete the pronouns and have them work in groups. You always have them work in groups because when they're working in groups, they're using the language naturally. Even if they're struggling, they're listening in the language, they're speaking in the language, they're using those sociolinguistic cues of adding their opinion, giving advice. So have them work in groups and have them talk about which would be the appropriate pronouns to insert in there. And you could even ask them why. I like to ask students why. Why did you put that there? Because that's making them reflect on the rule and reflect on their own learning and their own use. Because you want them to get the rules because in the hopes that they are able to someday edit their own work. Because that shows true grammatical competence when they can actually edit their own grammar and they know why something is wrong and they can fix it themselves. The other thing you can do, you could start with that and then get rid of the captions altogether and have them make up their own stories using pronouns because that's using it in natural language. The other thing you can do is follow up. So the more students use a target form, so when you teach them something, they're not going to go home that night and know how to use it correctly. That just does not happen. At what point do they use it correctly? No one knows. It's different from student to student. But we do know that the more they use it, the faster they'll learn. Okay, so get rid of all the captions. Have them make up their own stories using pronouns. Then just keep having them use the language. Follow up with questions using pronouns. Okay, why was John upset? He felt guilty about leaving his pets. He felt guilty about leaving them. Did the pets enjoy themselves? Yes, they had fun by themselves. Okay, so there you're having them work in groups. They're using the language. They're using it in speaking. They're also using it in writing. Then you can turn it into questions and again have them use the language in speaking and writing. So that's the biggest part, that no matter what you do, is have them use the language in many ways as naturally as possible. You could even then, if you have them make up their own stories, either have them insert the pronouns or have them make up their stories, then take the comics, give it to the group sitting next to them, and have the groups edit each other's work. Then you're teaching them the grammar form. You're teaching them how to use it in speaking. You're teaching them how to use it in writing, and you're teaching them how to edit it. Okay? So those are just some suggestions for teaching pronouns.